I was standing in the opulent lobby of a seven-star hotel in Dubai when my older brother sent the text that was meant to ruin my life. "We are cutting you loose. Your corporate card is canceled. Figure out how to get back to Atlanta yourself, loser. I will be taking credit for the Dubai deal at the press conference tomorrow morning." He thought he was leaving me stranded across the world with no money and no way home so he could steal my $100 million deal. He had no idea that while he was busy playing chief executive officer, I had been quietly building an empire that was about to swallow him whole. I am Camille, and I am 35 years old. Until that moment, I was the senior director of acquisitions for my family's Atlanta-based luxury hospitality firm. For the past 72 hours, I had not slept a wink. I had been sitting in high-stakes boardrooms, drinking endless cups of black coffee, negotiating the most lucrative international hotel merger our company had ever seen. I had done the financial modeling, the risk assessments, and the grueling face-to-face negotiations with the Dubai executives. Andre, my brother, had contributed absolutely nothing, but he carried the title of CEO because our mother, Valerie, believed the family business needed a male figurehead. I stood at the polished marble front desk of the Burj Al Arab, my luggage resting beside me. The concierge, a polite man in a tailored suit, swiped my corporate card through the machine. He frowned and tried it again. "I am so sorry, madam," he said, lowering his voice out of professional discretion. "The card has been declined." My phone vibrated in my hand. I looked down and read Andre's text. He had waited until the exact moment the ink was dry on the preliminary merger documents to cut off my financial lifeline. He knew my hotel bill was hovering around $8,000. He knew a last-minute international flight back to Georgia would cost thousands more. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to call him begging for a flight home so he could force me to hand over the final proprietary valuation files in exchange for a coach ticket. Instead of crying or causing a scene, I simply smiled at the concierge. "My apologies," I said smoothly. "Corporate accounting must be migrating our accounts this morning. Let me use another card." I reached into my designer handbag and bypassed the wallet, holding my useless company ID. From a hidden zippered pocket, I pulled out a solid metal matte black American Express Centurion card. It was a card my family had absolutely no idea existed. It was not linked to our hospitality firm. It was funded entirely by my own private, highly lucrative consulting firm, an LLC. I had quietly built over the last 5 years, while Andre spent his days playing golf at exclusive country clubs. The concierge swiped the heavy black card. It went through instantly. I signed the $8,000 receipt without blinking and handed it back to him. Then I unlocked my phone and replied to my brother's cruel text with a single sentence. "Thank you for letting me know." I did not wait for his reply. I tipped the bellhop generously and had my bags loaded into a waiting private car. As the luxury sedan glided through the sunlit streets of Dubai, heading toward the international airport, I pulled out my laptop and opened it on my knees. If Andre wanted to cut me loose, he was about to learn what happened when the anchor holding his entire career together suddenly detached. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, I had learned early on that love and respect in our household were distributed based on gender rather than merit. My mother, Valerie, was a formidable woman in the local business community, but she harbored deeply traditional views about succession. When our father passed away 5 years ago, leaving behind a thriving hospitality empire, she immediately placed Andre in the CEO chair. Andre was charismatic and handsome, but he was financially illiterate. I was the one with the advanced degree in economics. I was the one who spotted market trends and salvaged failing properties. Yet, my mother constantly reminded me of my place. "You have to support your brother Camille," she would say whenever I pointed out his reckless spending. "A strong black family needs a strong black man leading it. It is your duty to make sure he succeeds." For years, I swallowed my pride and did exactly that. I covered up his administrative errors. I stayed up late fixing his disastrous budget projections before board meetings. I did the grueling analytical work while he posed for magazine covers. But sitting in the back of that car, looking out at the desert skyline, I realized my duty to them was officially over. I logged into the company's secure administrative server. As the senior director of acquisitions, I had designed the entire digital infrastructure for our international clients. Andre barely knew how to open a spreadsheet. With a few rapid keystrokes, I located his administrative profile. I revoked his access to the master negotiation files for the Dubai merger. I changed the security protocols, locking him out of the client communication portal. I scrubbed his permissions from the financial projections I had built from scratch. It was a mechanical, silent action, but it felt more satisfying than any screaming match ever could. I was not stealing company property. I was simply securing my own intellectual labor. If he wanted to take credit for the deal at a press conference the next morning, he was going to have to do it without any of the actual data. I arrived at the airport and bypassed the main terminal entirely. Using my black card, I booked a first-class suite on the next Emirates flight to Atlanta. The sheer luxury of the private airport lounge stood in stark contrast to the betrayal I was processing. I took a hot shower in the lounge suite, changed into comfortable cashmere travel clothes, and boarded the massive aircraft. As I settled into my spacious private cabin, the flight attendant offered me a warm towel and asked what I would like to drink before takeoff. Champagne, please. I requested, sinking back into the plush leather seat. Just as I took my first sip, my phone illuminated with a barrage of incoming messages. Andre had finally tried to log into the system to download the files for his morning presentation. The texts came through in rapid, frantic succession. Camille, what is going on with the server? Why is my password bouncing back? Unlock the Dubai portal right now. I am not playing with you, Camille. Send me the master files immediately. He was panicking. The golden child, who had never faced a single consequence in his entire life, was suddenly staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar press conference with absolutely nothing to show for it. He could not answer a single technical question about the merger without my spreadsheets guiding him. My phone rang loudly, shattering the quiet elegance of the first-class cabin. It was Andre calling. I watched his name flash on the screen, feeling a profound sense of detachment. The little girl who used to crave her family's validation was gone. The exhausted executive who had broken her back to build their wealth was gone. In her place was a woman who finally recognized her own terrifying power. "Ma'am," the flight attendant murmured, leaning in politely, "we are preparing for takeoff. We ask that all passengers switch their devices to airplane mode." Of course. I smiled at her. I looked down at my ringing phone. I did not decline the call. I simply swiped down, opening my settings, and tapped the airplane icon. The call abruptly cut off, severing my connection to the ground, to Dubai, and to the family that had just tried to discard me. I placed the phone face down on the polished wood console next to my champagne. I had 14 hours of uninterrupted luxury ahead of me, 14 hours to rest and prepare for the war that was waiting for me in Atlanta, because cutting me loose was the worst financial decision Andre had ever made. And by the time I landed, he was going to realize exactly who really owned the keys to the kingdom. Halfway over the Atlantic Ocean, I reconnected my phone to the in-flight wireless internet. The cabin around me was completely silent, save for the low, comforting hum of the aircraft engines. But the digital world inside my phone was a certified war zone. My family group chat had exploded with dozens of messages while I was resting. I opened the application, and the vitriol immediately poured through the screen. At the very top were messages from my brother Andre and his white wife Bethany. Bethany had married into our family 5 years ago, drawn like a moth to the flame of our affluent Atlanta lifestyle. She had never worked a corporate job in her life, but she loved to play the role of the wealthy executive spouse. She constantly talked down to me, treating me more like the hired help than the actual brains behind her luxurious lifestyle. Her messages were dripping with venom. "Enjoy flying standby and economy, Camille. Andre and I are popping Doprin right now. It is about time this company belongs solely to us. You should have known better than to bite the hand that feeds you." I stared at her words. She truly believed I was currently sitting in a cramped middle seat somewhere, crying over my lost corporate card. She had absolutely no idea I was lying in a private first-class suite, sipping vintage champagne paid for by my own private wealth. But as irritating as Bethany was, her words were nothing compared to the messages from my mother Valerie. My mother was the matriarch of our family, a woman who commanded respect in Atlanta society, but who harbored deeply toxic and outdated views about gender roles. She had spent her entire life shielding Andre from the consequences of his own profound mediocrity. When I scrolled down to read her contribution to the group chat, a familiar heavy ache settled in my chest. "Camille, you brought this on yourself. You always try to outshine your brother. You need to learn your place as a Black woman supporting the head of this family. Give him the files and apologize right now. Do not destroy the family legacy over your own selfish pride. Learn my place. Support the head of the family." The words burned, but they were not surprising. This had been her mantra since I was a teenager. I remembered being 24 years old, fresh out of graduate school with a dual degree in finance and real estate. I had single-handedly closed a commercial property deal that saved our family firm from the brink of bankruptcy. I had stayed up for 5 nights straight, finding the legal loopholes that made the acquisition possible. But when the press release was drafted, my mother literally crossed my name off the document and replaced it with Andre's name. She told me that Andre needed the visibility to build his confidence as a young black man in the business world. She told me I needed to be the strong, silent backbone of his success. For over a decade, I had been that backbone. I had carried his dead weight. I had smiled politely at Gallus while he accepted awards for financial strategies I had written. I had allowed my own mother to diminish my brilliance to accommodate her son's fragile ego. She thought she could still use that guilt to control me. She thought I would read her message, break down in tears, and immediately send Andre the passwords to the Dubai client portal so he could secure his $100 million deal. But the woman who used to crave her mother's validation had died somewhere over the Mediterranean Sea. I felt no urge to argue with them. I felt no desire to explain my worth or defend my actions. Arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you is a waste of time, and my time was currently worth thousands of dollars an hour. I set my champagne glass down on the polished wood table of my suite. I opened my encrypted cloud drive and located the final signed contract from the Dubai executives. The truth about the Dubai deal was something Andre would never willingly confess to our mother. During the preliminary negotiations 3 days ago, he had completely humiliated himself. The investors were sharp, ruthless businessmen who did not care about Andre's tailored suits or his country club charm. They had asked him a direct question about yield capitalization rates and projected market depreciation over a 10-year timeline. Andre had frozen. He had started sweating, stammering, and flipping frantically through the binder I had prepared for him, completely unable to comprehend the numbers on the page. I had stepped in seamlessly, taking over the conversation in flawless financial terminology, salvaging the presentation before the investors could walk out of the room. After that disastrous meeting, the lead executive had requested a private dinner with me without my brother. He had looked me straight in the eye and told me they would never invest $100 million into a company run by an incompetent figurehead. However, he noted they were deeply impressed by my analytical prowess and strategic vision. He offered me a choice: lose the deal entirely or sign the contract through my own independent firm. I had chosen myself. Now flying high above the Atlantic, I took that verified, legally binding PDF document and dropped it directly into the family group chat. I did not write a long emotional paragraph. I did not demand an apology. I simply typed a single sentence: "There is no presentation for tomorrow. The client signed exclusively with my private firm." I hit send and watched the little notification confirm that the file had been delivered. For 3 full minutes, the group chat was completely silent. I could almost picture the scene back in Atlanta. Andre and Bethany sitting in their lavish living room, their champagne glasses frozen midair as they opened the document and read the binding signatures. I could imagine the color draining from my mother's face as she realized her golden boy had lost the biggest contract in our firm's history. Then the typing bubbles appeared. They danced wildly on the screen as panic erupted. Andre called my phone immediately. I let it go straight to voicemail. He called again. Again, I let it ring out. Then came the text from Bethany. It appeared on my screen in a flurry of typos driven by sheer blind terror. "You cannot do that, Camille. You have to give the contract back to the family company. Andre already spent the $3 million company advance on our new mansion in Alpharetta. We close on the house tomorrow." I stared at the screen, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. I read the message again just to be sure my eyes were not deceiving me. When a company is negotiating a merger of this magnitude, it is standard practice to receive an earnest money deposit or a preliminary operating advance to cover acquisition costs. The Dubai investors had wired $3 million to our family firm's corporate account 2 weeks ago, specifically earmarked for commercial real estate appraisals and legal fees. Bethany had just confirmed in writing that her husband had taken corporate funds allocated for international business development and illegally diverted them to purchase a private residential mansion for his wife. That was not a simple accounting error. That was federal embezzlement. It was wire fraud. It was a felony that carried severe prison time, and his arrogant, entitled wife had just documented his crime in a discoverable digital format because she was too panicked to think straight. My mother desperately tried to do damage control in the chat. Bethany, delete that message right now. Camille, do not respond to her. We will discuss this when you get back. We are family, and we will handle this privately. I took a screenshot of the entire conversation. I saved the image to 3 different secure locations. I did not reply to my mother's desperate plea. I did not gloat or throw Bethy's monumental stupidity back in her face. Silence is the most terrifying response you can give to people who are losing control. I locked my phone and leaned back into my seat, pulling the soft cashmere blanket over my legs. The turbulence of the past few days had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. My family had thought they were teaching me a lesson by canceling my corporate card and leaving me stranded. They thought they were stripping me of my resources. They had no idea that they had just handed me the financial guillotine I needed to sever their control over my life forever. I closed my eyes and let the steady rhythm of the airplane soothe me. By the time I touched down in Atlanta, the real war would begin. But for the first time in my 35 years of life, I knew I was walking onto the battlefield fully armed. The wheels of the aircraft touched down on the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. I took a slow, deep breath as the plane taxied to the gate. The quiet sanctuary of my first-class suite was behind me, and the harsh reality of the war I had just started was waiting just outside the terminal doors. I gathered my belongings and walked off the plane, feeling completely rested and terrifyingly sharp. I made my way through the bustling international terminal. The air was thick with the usual southern humidity, but my mind was ice cold. As I descended the escalator toward the luxury car service exit, I spotted them immediately. Lance and Kevin. They were 2 junior executives from our family firm who practically worshipped the ground my brother walked on. They were standing near the sliding glass doors, looking smug and overly confident in their stiff corporate suits. Andre had sent his little foot soldiers to ambush me. "Camille, wait right there," Lance said, stepping directly into my path to block the exit. He held out a thick manila envelope with a triumphant smirk on his face. "Andre said to give this to you the moment you landed. It is a formal cease and desist letter. You are legally barred from contacting any of the firm's clients or stepping foot on company property." I did not even break my stride. I stopped just inches from him and reached into my designer handbag. I pulled out a crisp white envelope of my own and slapped it firmly against his chest. "And this is a countersuit for corporate defamation and breach of contract," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Tell my brother, my legal team requires a formal response by 8 tomorrow morning. Have a blessed day, gentlemen." I walked right past them, leaving them standing completely frozen by the exit doors. My private driver was waiting at the curb. I settled into the plush leather back seat of the black SUV and pulled out my tablet. I knew Andre would not take the loss of the Dubai contract quietly. He was a narcissist who thrived on public validation, and he needed to control the narrative before the truth got out. I opened my social media applications and navigated to the prominent Atlanta business forums. My brother had been extremely busy while I was in the air. He had launched a massive coordinated smear campaign across the affluent African-American business networks in the city. He posted a long, highly emotional status about family loyalty and the pain of betrayal. He claimed I was a disgruntled former employee who had buckled under the immense pressure of international negotiations. He painted himself as the weary but resilient victim of a jealous younger sister who wanted to tear down a historic Black-owned enterprise out of pure spite. Comments were flooding in by the second. People I had known for years, community leaders and fellow executives, were offering him their deep sympathy. "It is a shame when our own people try to bring us down." One comment read, "Keep your head up, Andre. You are building a legacy." Another user posted, "I felt a brief flash of heat in my chest, but I pushed the anger down immediately." Responding online would only give him the messy public fight he desperately wanted. I refused to defend myself to a digital crowd of strangers. I preferred to fight where it actually caused permanent damage. I preferred to attack his infrastructure. My driver pulled up to my high-rise luxury condo in Buckhead. I thanked him, grabbed my bags, and went straight up to my penthouse. I did not bother unpacking. I went directly into my home office, dropped my bag on the floor, and booted up my custom-built desktop computer. 2 years ago, our family firm had desperately needed a digital overhaul. Andre had refused to pay for external software developers, claiming it was a waste of company funds. Because I cared about the business, I had spent my nights and weekends coding a proprietary valuation software from scratch. That software currently managed every single domestic client portfolio, operating budget, and financial projection for our entire company. Because I had built it independently on my own time, the intellectual property rights belonged entirely to my private consulting firm. I had simply been licensing it to the family business for free as a favor to my mother. That favor expired today. I logged into the Master Administrative Control panel. I located the active licensing agreement for our family hospitality group. I hovered my mouse over the cancellation button and clicked twice. The digital screen flashed green, confirming the action. Instantly, every single computer in my brother's downtown Atlanta office went completely dark. Every client portfolio, every financial projection, and every active operating budget was abruptly locked behind a military encryption wall. I had just revoked their software license. Andre's entire domestic operation ground to a catastrophic, unreoverable halt in the middle of the workday. Less than 10 minutes after I initiated the digital blackout, my phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. Valerie was not the type of woman to call unless she wanted to issue a command or demand an apology. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. "Camille, what have you done?" Her voice was shrill and frantic, echoing loudly through the speaker. "The entire office system is down. The information technology department says you maliciously locked us out of our own servers." "I revoked my proprietary software license," I said calmly, leaning back in my office chair. "Andre fired me via text message. Remember, I am no longer an employee of the firm. You do not get to keep using my private intellectual property for free." "We are blood, Camille," she cried, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "How can you destroy your own brother's livelihood like this? You are tearing this family apart over your selfish pride. Fix the system right now before we lose all our domestic clients. Please, Camille, remember who raised you." I stared out the floor to ceiling windows of my office. "Blood left me stranded in a foreign country with a canceled credit card," I replied, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "Blood told me to learn my place and stay quiet. You chose to protect a man who has been actively stealing from his own company for years." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, the panic in her voice shifting to genuine confusion. "I am talking about the $3 million advance from the Dubai investors," I said smoothly. "The corporate funds Andre just embezzled to buy Bethany a brand new mansion in Alpharetta. But that is just the beginning. Mom, I have spent the last 3 years quietly compiling a comprehensive dossier of every fraudulent tax return and every single embezzled corporate expense Andre ran to fund Bethy's luxury cars and designer bags." I heard her breath catch sharply in her throat. "I submitted that entire dossier to the federal tax authorities this morning," I continued, refusing to let her interrupt. "I suggest you stop worrying about the software and go check the firm's primary operating accounts immediately." The line went dead. I set my phone down on the glass desk. I knew exactly what was happening at that precise moment. Valerie was frantically logging into the corporate banking portal with trembling hands, only to find every single family business account completely frozen by a federal mandate. The financial guillotine had finally dropped, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop the bleeding. The heavy wheels of my commercial aircraft finally touched down on the tarmac at the Atlanta International Airport. I took a slow, deep breath as the massive plane taxied toward the gate. The quiet, isolated sanctuary of my first-class suite was now officially behind me, and the harsh, brutal reality of the corporate war I had just ignited was waiting for me just outside the terminal doors. I gathered my personal belongings and walked off the plane, feeling completely rested and terrifyingly sharp. I made my way through the bustling international concourse. The air inside the airport was thick with the usual chaotic energy of a busy weekday afternoon, but my mind was operating with ice-cold precision. I had spent the last 14 hours mentally preparing for the retaliation I knew was coming. My brother Andre was deeply predictable. When cornered, he always lashed out using intimidation and public embarrassment. As I descended the long escalator toward the luxury car service exit, I spotted his welcoming committee immediately: Malik and Jordan. They were 2 junior executives from our family firm who practically worshipped the ground my brother walked on. They were standing near the sliding glass exit doors, looking incredibly smug and overly confident in their stiff, tailored corporate suits. They held themselves with the arrogant posture of men who believed they held all the power in the room, simply because they worked directly under the male head of the family. Andre had sent his loyal little foot soldiers to ambush me at baggage claim, hoping to break my spirit before I even made it home to my own apartment. "Camille, wait right there," Malik said, stepping directly into my path to block the exit. He puffed out his chest and held out a thick manila envelope with a triumphant smirk plastered across his face. "Andre said to give this to you the very moment you landed. It is a formal cease and desist letter drafted by our corporate attorneys. You are officially terminated effective immediately. You are legally barred from contacting any of the firm clients. And if you step foot on company property, security will have you arrested for trespassing." Jordan nodded beside him, crossing his arms to look intimidating. "You really messed up this time, Camille." Andre is furious. I did not even break my stride. I stopped just inches from Malik, looking him directly in the eyes with a calm, empty expression that made his smug smile falter. I reached into my designer leather handbag. I did not pull out a tissue to cry. I did not pull out my phone to call my mother and beg for mercy. I pulled out a crisp white envelope of my own and slapped it firmly against his chest, forcing him to grab it before it fell to the floor. "And this is a countersuit for corporate defamation. Hostile workplace environment and breach of contract," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "It was drafted by my private legal team while I was flying over the ocean. You can let my brother know my attorneys require a formal response by 8 tomorrow morning. Now, step aside before I have airport security escort you away for harassment." Both men completely froze. The arrogant bravado vanished from their faces, replaced by genuine shock. They had fully expected to see a broken, weeping woman begging for her job back. Instead, they were staring at a woman who had just handed them a legal nightmare. I walked right past them, leaving them standing speechless by the exit doors. My private driver was waiting at the curb. I settled into the plush leather back seat of the black utility vehicle and pulled out my tablet. I knew Andre would not take the loss of the Dubai contract quietly. He was a textbook narcissist who thrived on public validation. He needed to control the narrative before the truth got out to our investors and the local business community. I opened my social media applications and navigated to the prominent Atlanta Business Network forums. My brother had been extremely busy while I was in the air. He had launched a massive coordinated smear campaign across the affluent African-American business networks in the city. Atlanta is a city deeply rooted in Black excellence and family legacy. Andre knew exactly which cultural buttons to push to make himself the victim. He had posted a long, highly emotional status update about family loyalty, the burden of leadership, and the profound pain of betrayal. He claimed I was a disgruntled former employee who had buckled under the immense pressure of international negotiations. He painted himself as the weary but resilient chief executive officer who was forced to make a difficult professional decision regarding an unstable sister who wanted to tear down a historic Black-owned enterprise out of pure spite. "It is with a heavy heart that I must announce the termination of my sister from our family firm," his post began. "Building a lasting legacy in Atlanta is challenging enough without facing sabotage from within your own bloodline. The pressure of our international expansion was simply too much for her mental health, and she made reckless decisions that jeopardized our most valuable clients. I tried to guide her, but I must protect the family business first. Please pray for our family during this painful transition as we continue to push our culture forward." The comments were flooding in by the second. It was a masterclass in manipulation. People I had known for years, community leaders, local politicians, and fellow executives were offering him their deep sympathy. "It is a shame when our own people try to bring us down." One comment read from a local real estate developer. "Keep your head up, Andre. You are building a legacy," another user posted. A prominent local pastor even replied praising Andre for his strong moral leadership during a time of familial grief. The sheer audacity of his lies made my stomach turn. I had built that legacy. I wrote the proposals that those same politicians praised. I structured the charitable funds that those pastors depended on. I was the one who negotiated the deals that kept our family name respected in the city. But my mother Valerie and my brother Andre had always ensured I stayed hidden in the shadows, so the public only ever saw his face. They took my brilliance, packaged it under his name, and sold it to the world, and now he was using the very community I had helped uplift to publicly crucify me. He wanted me to read those comments and feel so isolated and ashamed that I would surrender the Dubai client just to earn back my family favor. He wanted me to type out a desperate, defensive paragraph in the comment section so he could point to it as proof of my instability. He wanted to watch me unravel in front of the entire Atlanta business elite. I felt a brief flash of intense heat in my chest, but I pushed the anger down immediately. Responding online would only give him the messy public fight he desperately wanted. I refused to defend my professional reputation to a digital crowd of strangers who only knew the fictional version of my family. Arguing on the internet is a tactic for people who lack real power. I preferred to fight where it actually caused permanent financial damage. I preferred to attack the very infrastructure he was trying to protect. My driver pulled up to my high-rise luxury condominium building in Buckhead. I thanked him, grabbed my bags, and went straight up to my penthouse. I did not bother unpacking my clothes. I did not bother checking my mail or pouring a glass of water. I went directly into my home office, dropped my bag on the hardwood floor, and booted up my custom-built desktop computer. Andre wanted to play the role of the powerful executive. He wanted to convince the world that he was the sole architect of our family wealth. I was about to show him exactly what happens when the real architect decides to demolish the building. I cracked my knuckles and opened my administrative dashboard, ready to initiate a digital blackout that would bring his entire world crashing down. I stared at the glowing dual monitors on my glass desk, watching the live data stream of our family business. The cursor hovered over the master administrative control panel for the proprietary valuation software. 2 years ago, our luxury hospitality firm had desperately needed a massive digital overhaul. Our domestic client portfolios were expanding, and we were acquiring boutique hotels across Atlanta faster than our outdated legacy systems could handle. Andre had flatly refused to allocate company funds to hire external software developers. He stood in the main conference room in his bespoke suit and told the executive board that technology upgrades were a waste of capital that could be better spent on executive bonuses and aggressive marketing. Because I actually cared about the survival and efficiency of the business, I took matters into my own hands. I spent 10 months of my nights and weekends coding a comprehensive property valuation and client management software from scratch. I built a system that managed every high net worth client portfolio, every commercial real estate appraisal, every hotel operating budget, and every payroll distribution for our 800 employees. Because I developed the platform entirely independently on my own time and with my own resources. The intellectual property rights belonged exclusively to my private consulting firm. I had registered the copyright and the patents under my own limited liability company. For 2 years, I had simply been licensing the software to the family business for free. It was a silent favor to my mother, Valerie, an unspoken contribution to keep our historic Black-owned enterprise functioning smoothly. While Andre took all the credit for our record-breaking profit margins, that charitable favor officially expired today. I opened the active licensing agreement dashboard. I located the central enterprise key assigned to our corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta. My heart did not race. My hands did not shake. I felt nothing but a profound, heavy sense of finality. I clicked the button to revoke the license. The digital screen flashed a bright green verification banner confirming the action. Instantly, a cascading digital blackout swept through the company servers. From my penthouse office, I could monitor the live system status as it happened. One by one, the green connection indicators on my screen turned a stark, flashing red. Down in the city center at our lavish corporate headquarters, the impact was immediate and catastrophic. Every single computer terminal, every executive tablet, and every administrative dashboard went completely dark. The software instantly logged out every active user and locked the entire company database behind a Millionaire encryption wall. They were entirely severed from the central nervous system of the business. Less than 3 minutes after I initiated the blackout, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently across the surface of my desk. I did not need to look at the screen to know who was calling. The sheer panic was already radiating through the device. The first call was from Calvin, the chief financial officer. Calvin was a seasoned numbers man who had known me since I was a teenager. He was one of the few people in the executive suite who actually understood that I was the one keeping the company afloat. I let the phone ring 4 times before I calmly picked it up and answered. "Camille, what is happening?" Calvin asked, his voice breathless and strained. "The entire network just crashed. We are getting a critical error message saying the enterprise software license has been revoked. The information technology department is locked out of the mainframe. We have vendors waiting for authorization and the client portals are completely frozen. Please tell me this is just a server migration glitch." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and watched the red error logs multiplying on my monitor. "It is not a glitch, Calvin," I said, keeping my tone warm, but entirely professional. My proprietary software license has been officially revoked. As of an hour ago, Andre terminated my employment via text message and followed it up with a formal cease and desist letter at the airport. I am no longer an employee of the firm. Therefore, the company no longer enjoys complimentary access to my private intellectual property. There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the muffled sounds of absolute chaos echoing in the background of Calvin's office. I heard junior executives shouting in the hallways. I heard office phones ringing endlessly as high net worth clients tried to log into their investment portfolios only to find error screens. "Camille, you cannot be serious," Calvin whispered, sounding as though the air had been knocked out of his lungs. "You own the source code. You know, we do not have a backup system in place. Andre refused to approve the budget for redundant cloud storage. If you lock us out, we cannot process payroll on Friday. We cannot authorize the operational budgets for the boutique hotels in Midtown. The entire domestic operation is paralyzed." "I am completely serious, Calvin," I replied smoothly. "Andre made a unilateral executive decision to cut me loose. He publicly announced my termination on social media, claiming he needed to protect the family business from my alleged incompetence. I am simply respecting his authority as the chief executive officer. He can figure out how to manage the portfolios manually." Calvin groaned a sound of pure, unadulterated defeat. "He knows nothing about those portfolios, and you know it. Camille, please. I am begging you. Do not let his arrogance destroy the entire company. We have hundreds of employees depending on those payroll distributions." I felt a brief flicker of sympathy for Calvin, but I quickly extinguished it. For years, the entire executive board had enabled Andrea's behavior. They had watched my mother diminish my contributions, and they had stayed perfectly silent to protect their own comfortable salaries. They had allowed Andre to treat me like a glorified assistant while leveraging my brilliance to line their own pockets. "I am sorry, Calvin," I said firmly, "but the era of me setting myself on fire to keep this family warm is over. My legal team will be sending a formal notification regarding the intellectual property revocation. I suggest you advise my brother to stop posting inspirational quotes on the internet and start looking for a very good software developer. Have a wonderful afternoon." "Wonderful." I ended the call and set the phone face down on my desk. The operational hemorrhage I had just unleashed was staggering. By revoking the software, I had effectively blinded the entire executive team. They could not see how much money was moving in or out of the corporate accounts. They could not process guest reservations at our flagship properties. They could not access the critical financial projections required for their upcoming quarterly board meeting. Andre had spent the morning trying to publicly humiliate me, attempting to control the narrative by playing the noble, burdened leader of a historic Black enterprise. He had weaponized our community against me, expecting me to cower in shame. But reputation and social media sympathy do not keep the lights on. Likes and comments do not process multi-million-dollar real estate transactions. He was about to learn a very brutal lesson in the difference between appearing powerful and actually possessing power. My phone vibrated again. Then it rang consecutively 3 more times. The caller identification flashed with names from the upper management team, the head of human resources, the director of domestic acquisitions, the vice president of marketing. I ignored every single one of them. The panic was spreading like a wildfire through the corporate hierarchy. They were finally realizing that the quiet, dependable sister they had all taken for granted was actually the load-bearing pillar of the entire organization, and I had just walked away, letting the roof collapse directly onto their heads. I turned my attention back to my computer screen. The digital blockade was absolute and impenetrable. I had built the encryption specifically to withstand any internal hacking attempts from the company servers. There was no backdoor. There was no override switch. The only way to restore the system was for me to manually reactivate the license key, and that was never going to happen. I poured myself a glass of iced water and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, looking out over the sprawling green canopy of Buckhead. In the distance, I could just make out the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta, where my brother was currently experiencing the most spectacular professional meltdown of his life. He had wanted a war. He had drawn the battle lines while I was mourning the loss of a massive international deal he had nearly ruined. Now he was trapped in a burning building with no exit strategy and absolutely no comprehension of the flames that were about to consume him. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, watching the distant downtown skyline. The silence in my home office was heavy and satisfying, But I knew it was only a temporary lull. The real heavyweight champion of family manipulation had not yet entered the ring. Right on cue, my personal cell phone began to ring. The caller identification flashed with my mother's name, Valerie. For 35 years, that name on a screen would have sent a jolt of anxiety straight through my chest. My mother was a master architect of emotional warfare. She had built her entire identity around being the formidable matriarch of a successful Black business family in Atlanta. She commanded respect at charity galas and country club luncheons. But behind closed doors, she ruled our family through guilt comparison and relentless demands for loyalty. And her loyalty always flowed in exactly one direction toward Andre. I let the phone ring 4 times. I took a slow sip of my iced water, letting the condensation cool my palm. I needed to be entirely grounded for this conversation. When I finally picked up the phone, I did not say hello. I simply listened. "Camille, what have you done?" My mother's voice came through the speaker, shrill and vibrating with manufactured panic. "The entire office system is completely down. Calvin just came into my office looking like he was about to have a heart attack. He said, 'You maliciously locked us out of our own corporate servers. Tell me this is some kind of sick joke.'" I walked back to my glass desk and sat down. "It is not a joke, Mother," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of the emotional response she was fishing for. "I revoked my proprietary software license. Andre made a unilateral executive decision to terminate my employment via text message while I was in the Middle East. He followed it up by sending his little corporate lapdogs to ambush me at the airport with a cease and desist letter. Since I am no longer an employee of your firm, you no longer enjoy complimentary access to my private intellectual property." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Then came the tears. The crying started instantly, a theatrical performance she had perfected over decades. "We are blood, Camille," she sobbed, her voice cracking with the precise amount of anguish designed to break me. "How can you destroy your own brother's livelihood like this? You are tearing this family apart over your selfish pride. We are a historic Black enterprise in this city. People look up to us. Fix the system right now before we lose all our domestic clients. Please, Camille. Remember who raised you." I closed my eyes and let the sheer audacity of her words wash over me. A year ago, that speech would have worked. I would have felt the crushing weight of ancestral guilt. I would have logged back into the system, restored the license, and apologized for overreacting. I would have set myself on fire to keep their false image of family excellence burning bright. I remembered how many of my own personal milestones I had sacrificed to protect her golden boy. I remembered missing my own college graduation dinner because Andre had bungled a client contract and Valerie begged me to stay at the office to fix it so he would not look bad in front of the board. Not today. Blood left me stranded in a foreign country with a canceled corporate card. I replied, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. Blood stole the $100 million international merger I spent 72 sleepless hours negotiating. Do not dare speak to me about family loyalty when you just sat back and allowed your son to publicly humiliate me on social media. You chose to protect a man who has been actively destroying this company for years. He is under a lot of stress, Camille. My mother fired back immediately, pivoting to defend him. You know how hard it is for a Black man to maintain authority in this industry. He made a rash decision because he was intimidated by your aggressive negotiating tactics in Dubai. If you would just learn your place and support him from behind the scenes, none of this would be happening. You just could not stand letting him shine. Learn my place. I gripped the edge of my desk. The sheer disrespect was staggering, but it fueled my precision. My place is at the top of the food chain, Mother, I said smoothly. And as for Andre's stress, let us talk about what is really stressing him out. Let us talk about the $3 million operational advance from the Dubai investors. The corporate funds he just embezzled to buy Bethany, a brand new mansion in Alpharetta. The crying on the other end of the line stopped instantly. The silence was deafening. I do not know what you are talking about. My mother stammered, the panic in her voice shifting from theatrical to genuine. That money was allocated for international expansion. Please stop insulting my intelligence, I said. I saw the text messages Bethany sent to the group chat while I was flying home. She was bragging about closing on the house tomorrow using company funds. But honestly, that $3 million is just a drop in the bucket compared to what I know. Camille, whatever you think you know, my mother tried to interject, her tone turning desperate. I am not thinking, Mother. I know. I am the one who balances the books. I am the one who has spent the last 3 years quietly compiling a comprehensive dossier of every single fraudulent tax return and every embezzled corporate expense Andre ran to fund Bethy's luxury lifestyle. I could hear her breathing fast and shallow through the speaker. She knew exactly what I was talking about. She had enabled it. She had always justified Bethy's outrageous spending as the cost of doing business in high society. I have every receipt. I continued relentlessly. I have the documentation for the fake shell companies he set up to funnel money out of the operational budget. I have the tax write-offs for Bethy's imported luxury vehicles. I have the fraudulent expense reports where he marked her $60,000 designer handbag collections as corporate client gifting. You thought you could treat me like a glorified assistant, while the two of you bled my father's legacy dry to keep a white woman in designer clothes. Camille, please, she begged. And this time, the tears were absolutely real. You cannot do anything with that information. It would destroy everything your father built. It would send your brother to prison. We can fix the accounts. We can sell the new house. Just keep this in the family. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my desk. It is too late for that, I said, my voice completely devoid of mercy. You told me to learn my place, and I did. My place is with the federal authorities. What do you mean? She gasped. I mean, I submitted that entire dossier to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Federal Tax Authorities at 6 this morning. I stated clearly and deliberately. I handed over 3 years of irrefutable evidence of felony wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion. A guttural sob escaped my mother's throat. You ruined us, she wailed. You ruined your own flesh and blood. I did not ruin anything, I replied. I simply stopped hiding the ruin you and Andre created. I suggest you stop worrying about my proprietary software and go check the firm's primary operating accounts immediately. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice trembling with absolute terror. When the federal authorities receive verified proof of multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement, their first immediate action is to prevent capital flight, I explained, adopting the clinical tone of a seasoned financial executive. I suggest you log into the corporate banking portal right now. I did not wait for her to respond. I pressed the red button on my screen, ending the call. The silence returned to my penthouse, but it felt different this time. It felt victorious. Down in the city center, I knew exactly what was happening. Valerie was frantically pulling up her internet browser. Her manicured hands were shaking as she typed in the secure passwords for our family business's primary financial institution. She would navigate to the master account dashboard, praying that I was bluffing, praying that her golden son was still protected by the invisible shield of family privilege, but the screen would not load the available balances. Instead, she would be greeted by a stark, uncompromising federal notification banner blocking her access. She would find every single corporate checking account, every payroll distribution fund, and every emergency reserve completely and totally frozen by a federal mandate. The financial guillotine had finally dropped, the lifeblood of the company was cut off, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop the bleeding. They had pushed me out into the cold, believing I would freeze to death alone. They had no idea I was the one controlling the weather. I ended the call with my mother and left my phone face down on my glass desk. The silence in my penthouse was absolute and deeply comforting. I knew exactly what was happening in the city below me. Valerie was staring at a computer screen displaying a federal freeze notice. The money was gone, but while the corporate headquarters descended into absolute chaos, my brother Andre and his wife Bethany were completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse I had just unleashed upon them. They were attending the annual Heritage Excellence Gala at a luxury hotel in Buckhead. It was the most exclusive charity event of the season for the African-American business elite of Atlanta. It was a room filled with generations of old money, powerful politicians, and prominent real estate developers. Andre had likely spent hours mingling, shaking hands, and accepting premature congratulations for the international Dubai merger he falsely believed he had secured. Bethany was busy playing the role of the wealthy chief executive officer's wife, parading around the grand ballroom in a custom designer gown paid for by the very company funds she was helping to drain. According to colleagues who were in attendance that night, Bethany had been bragging loudly to anyone who would listen about her upcoming mansion purchase in Alpharetta. She wanted everyone in Atlanta High society to know that she was climbing to the very top of the social ladder. The highlight of the evening was the charity silent auction. Bethany always used charity auctions to publicly flaunt our family wealth. She spotted the premier auction item of the night, an exclusive two-stay at a private luxury villa in Street Barts. Without consulting her husband, she confidently marched up to the auction coordinator and placed a winning bid of $20,000. She wanted everyone in the room to see her drop that kind of money without a single second thought. The coordinator, a prominent socialite in our community, smiled brightly and ran Bethy's premium credit card through the mobile payment terminal. The terminal beeped with a harsh metallic sound of rejection. The screen flashed red, indicating the transaction was declined. Bethany laughed it off loudly, claiming it was a simple fraud alert because of her recent high-end purchases. She reached into her clutch and handed the coordinator a different card. This one was directly linked to our family business's primary operating accounts. The coordinator swiped it. The terminal beeped again, declined. People standing nearby began to notice the commotion. The polite murmurs of the gala quieted as the wealthy guests turned their attention to the awkward scene at the auction table. Bethany grew indignant, raising her voice and accusing the coordinator of having a faulty machine. She demanded they try a third time. Andre, noticing the scene from across the room, hurried over to save face. He pulled out his own wallet with a smooth, confident smile, apologizing for his wife's banking inconvenience. He handed over his signature corporate card, the very same account he used to fund his lavish lifestyle. The machine rejected it instantly. A visible bead of sweat formed on Andre's forehead. He quickly tried his personal checking card, declined. Every single financial lifeline attached to his name was completely frozen by the federal government. The whispers rippled through the ballroom like a shockwave. Atlanta society is a small, tightly knit circle, and nothing spreads faster than the scent of sudden financial ruin. People were staring. Old money families do not get their cards declined at charity galas unless something is catastrophically wrong. Desperate to understand what was happening, Andre pulled out his cell phone to call his bank. When he unlocked his screen, he was greeted by dozens of missed calls and a flood of frantic text messages from our mother and Calvin, the chief financial officer. The messages were explicit. The Criminal Investigation Division had seized the accounts. The federal tax authorities were auditing the firm. The corporate money was entirely gone. The reality of the federal tax investigation hit him right there in the middle of the crowded ballroom. The facade of the powerful chief executive officer crumbled in an instant. He grabbed Bethany by the arm, gripping her tight enough to make her gasp, and dragged her out of the venue, leaving their pristine social reputation shattered on the marble floor. Back in my penthouse, I poured myself a generous glass of expensive red wine and settled into the plush velvet sofa in my living room. I looked out over the glittering city skyline, feeling a profound sense of peace. My phone began to chime with new voicemail notifications. Andre had finally checked his messages from Valerie and realized that I was the architect of his total destruction. I connected my phone to my surround sound speakers, set my wine glass on the coffee table, and pressed play on the first message. "Camille, you better pick up this phone right now." His voice roared through my living room speakers, vibrating with pure, unadulterated rage. "Valerie just told me what you did to the accounts. You are completely out of your mind if you think you can pull a stunt like this and get away with it. I am the chief executive officer of this enterprise. I will have you arrested for corporate sabotage. You have exactly 10 minutes to call the authorities and tell them you made a mistake with those tax documents, or I swear I will destroy your consulting firm." I smiled, taking a slow sip of my wine. He was still trying to lead with intimidation. He still thought he held authority over me. I let the first voicemail end and tapped play on the second one, which had arrived just 5 minutes later. The aggressive bravado was already cracking, giving way to mounting panic as the gravity of federal involvement set in. "Camille, answer the phone," he shouted, sounding completely out of breath, like he was pacing frantically outside the hotel valet. "The bank is telling me there is a hard federal hold on all our assets. They will not even tell me what the charges are. What exactly did you give the Criminal Investigation Division? You cannot do this to me, Camille. I have vendors to pay tomorrow morning. Bethany is screaming at me in the car. Just call me back so we can fix this before the board of directors finds out. I order you to call me back." I leaned my head against the back of the sofa. It was fascinating to hear him unravel so quickly. He was so accustomed to me fixing his catastrophic mistakes that he genuinely believed I could just call the federal government and ask them to ignore years of documented wire fraud. I pressed play on the third and final voicemail, which had been left nearly an hour later. The transformation was complete. The arrogant brother who had callously texted me to figure out my own flight home from Dubai was entirely gone. In his place was a terrified, desperate man facing the destruction of his freedom. "Camille, please." He begged, his voice trembling with heavy, unshed tears. "Please pick up the phone. I am so sorry about what happened in Dubai. I was stressed out about the investors, and I made a terrible mistake canceling your company card. But you cannot send me to federal prison over a petty argument. We are family. I am your big brother. You cannot let them take everything away from me. Think about our father's legacy. Please just tell me how to stop the audit. I will step down. I will give you whatever you want. Please, Camille. I need you to save me." I listened to his pathetic pleas while watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He was not apologizing for stealing millions of dollars from our father's legacy to buy luxury cars and mansions. He was not apologizing for allowing his entitled wife to disrespect me on a daily basis. He was not apologizing for treating me like a disposable workhorse for a decade. He was only apologizing because he had finally been caught, and the consequences were inescapable. I deleted the voicemails one by one. I had absolutely no intention of calling him back. The federal authorities already had the comprehensive dossier, and no amount of begging, crying, or manipulating could unring that bell. He had dug his own grave with every fraudulent expense report he ever signed. I was simply the one who finally pushed him in. I finished my glass of wine, turned off the speakers, and went to sleep, knowing that tomorrow morning would bring the final devastating blow to his crumbling empire. The sun rose over the Atlanta skyline, casting a brilliant golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. I had slept a full 8 hours. It was the deepest, most restorative sleep I had experienced in years. I woke up without an alarm, feeling a profound sense of clarity. Today was the day the entire foundation of my family's toxic empire would finally crumble to dust. I walked into my kitchen and prepared a double shot of espresso. While the rich, dark coffee brewed, I opened my encrypted email on my tablet. Sitting right at the top of my inbox was an urgent calendar invitation. It had been sent at 3:00 the morning by Andre. The subject line read, "Emergency Executive Board Meeting. Compulsory attendance required." Attached was a highly irregular agenda titled Corporate Restructuring and Equity Reallocation. I took a slow sip of my espresso and smiled at the screen. Andre was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always revert to their most basic instincts. His instinct was theft. He was facing an active federal tax investigation, a frozen corporate bank account, and a total operational blackout. He needed millions of dollars in liquid capital immediately to pay off the impending federal fines and avoid prison time. Because he had completely drained the company reserves to fund Bethy's luxury lifestyle, he had to find the money somewhere else. His brilliant, desperate plan was to formally strip me of my shares in the family trust. He intended to convince the board of directors to vote me out, dilute my 30% equity to absolutely zero, and reabsorb my shares into the company general fund. He actually believed he could steal my hard-earned equity, sell it off, and use the proceeds to cover up his own multi-million-dollar embezzlement. The sheer arrogance of his financial ignorance was almost breathtaking. I walked into my closet and selected a sharply tailored emerald green blazer. Even though I was only attending the meeting virtually, I was going to look immaculate. I styled my hair flawlessly and applied a bold red lip. Power dressing is a psychological weapon, and I wanted my brother to see exactly what an untouchable woman looked like. At exactly 8:00 the morning, I sat down at my glass desk and clicked the secure video link to join the meeting. The camera feed flickered to life, displaying the main conference room at our downtown corporate headquarters. The contrast between my serene, sunlit penthouse and the atmosphere in that room was jarring. The conference room looked like a bunker in the middle of a war zone. Because I had revoked the software license, the massive digital presentation screens on the wall were completely black. The smart lighting system was functioning on an emergency default setting, casting harsh shadows across the mahogany table. The board of directors sat around the table looking deeply uncomfortable. These were my late father's oldest friends and colleagues. They were wealthy black real estate moguls, prominent pastors, and retired executives who had always patted Andre on the back and treated me like the invisible secretary. They were men who valued appearances and old-school loyalty above all else. Today, they looked terrified. At the head of the table stood Andre. He looked absolutely horrendous. The slick, charismatic chief executive officer who had mocked me on the family group chat just yesterday was entirely gone. His bespoke suit was rumpled. The bags under his eyes were dark and heavy. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He had clearly not slept a single minute since his credit cards were declined at the charity gala the night before. When he saw my video feed pop up on the laptop at the end of the table, his eyes narrowed with pure hatred. But he quickly masked it, pasting on a somber, deeply serious expression for the benefit of the board members. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice." Andre began, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat. "As you are all aware, our firm is currently experiencing a critical operational emergency. Yesterday, our domestic servers were subjected to an aggressive cyber attack that locked us out of our own client portfolios." I raised an eyebrow, taking a casual sip of my coffee. A cyber attack. He was actually trying to spin my lawful revocation of my own intellectual property as a malicious hacking incident. Furthermore, Andre continued, pacing at the head of the table. "Our primary operating accounts have been placed under a temporary administrative freeze by our banking partners. This is due to a series of highly irregular, reckless international transactions initiated by my sister Camille during her recent trip to Dubai." The sheer audacity of the lie was magnificent. He was standing in front of the board of directors blaming me for the federal freeze. He was trying to convince these seasoned businessmen that my hotel bill in Dubai had somehow triggered a massive federal audit. "It is with a heavy heart that I must address the reality of this situation," Andre said, placing his hands flat on the mahogany table and leaning forward. "Camille has buckled under the pressure of her position. Her mental health has severely deteriorated. When I attempted to gently remove her from the Dubai negotiations to protect the firm, she lashed out. She sabotaged our servers and jeopardized our financial standing out of pure spite. We cannot allow one unstable individual to destroy everything our father built." Several of the board members nodded, murmuring their sympathetic agreement. They were so eager to protect their monthly dividends that they were willing to swallow any ridiculous story he fed them. "Because our digital infrastructure is currently compromised," Andre said, gesturing to the blank screens, "I have had to print the emergency resolutions manually." He passed thick stacks of paper down the table. The sharp crinkle of the paper echoed loudly in the tense room. It was a pathetic sight. A premier luxury hospitality firm reduced to passing out physical paper packets because the chief executive officer had alienated the only person who knew how to run the business. "This packet contains a formal resolution for emergency restructuring." Andre announced, his voice growing louder, gaining false confidence. "I am proposing an immediate vote to sever Camille from the family trust. Her actions constitute gross misconduct and corporate sabotage. We will dilute her equity to zero and absorb her shares back into the firm. We will then liquidate those shares to bypass the temporary banking freeze, ensure our payroll is funded, and restore our operational stability. It is the only way to save the company." He looked incredibly proud of himself. He had constructed a narrative where he was the noble savior, making the agonizing decision to cut off his own sister to protect the employees and the legacy of the business. I sat in my office perfectly still. My microphone was firmly muted. I did not interrupt him. I did not scream that he was a liar. I did not defend my mental health or my professional integrity. I simply watched him perform. There is an old saying in business negotiations: never interrupt your opponent when they are in the process of destroying themselves. Andre finished his grand, sweeping speech and returned to the head of the table. He looked directly into the laptop webcam, staring right at my face on the screen. He thought he had completely outmaneuvered me. He thought he had successfully backed me into a corner where I would be forced to surrender my software and my silence just to beg for my shares back. "Camille," he said, his voice dripping with condescension and false pity, "as a courtesy, we are allowing you the opportunity to speak before the board executes this vote. Turn on your microphone. Explain yourself to these men who trusted you. Tell us why you decided to attack your own family." The entire boardroom went dead silent. Every single man at that table leaned forward, waiting for me to break down. They expected me to cry. They expected me to launch into a frantic emotional defense that would only prove Andre's point about my supposed instability. I slowly set my coffee cup down on the glass desk. I reached forward and clicked the button to unmute my microphone. I was not going to give them tears. I was going to give them a financial education they would never forget. The soft chime of my microphone, unmuting, echoed clearly through the dark conference room in downtown Atlanta. Every man sitting around that expansive mahogany table stiffened. They braced themselves for the hysterical weeping of a broken woman. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said. My voice flowed through the high-deafened speakers with absolute smooth precision. It was calm, deep, and completely devoid of the panic Andre had promised them. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the quiet confidence of my tone settle over the room. I watched the collective confusion wash across the faces of my late father's oldest friends. Pastor Williams adjusted his glasses, looking at the screen as if trying to reconcile the confident woman he was hearing with the mentally unstable saboteur Andre had just described. Mr. Sterling, a prominent commercial real estate developer, shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. Andre gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles were turning white. "Camille," he barked, his voice laced with forced authority, "we do not have time for your usual theatrics. You are going to explain why you launched a cyber attack against this family business, and then you are going to restore the servers." I did not even blink. I kept my gaze fixed directly on the board members, ignoring my brother entirely. "There was no cyber attack, gentlemen," I stated clearly. "Yesterday morning, while I was standing in the lobby of the Burj Al Arab, having successfully negotiated the $100 million Dubai merger, Andre sent me a text message. He informed me that I was officially terminated. He canceled my corporate credit card, leaving me stranded in the Middle East, and told me to figure out how to get home myself. He then sent 2 junior executives to ambush me at baggage claim with a formal cease and desist letter banning me from company property. The men around the table exchanged sharp, alarmed glances. They turned to look at Andre, who was suddenly struggling to swallow. He had not told them about the termination. He had not told them he abandoned his own sister overseas. "Because I am no longer an employee of this firm," I continued, my voice echoing in the silent room. "I am under no legal obligation to provide complimentary access to my private intellectual property. The valuation software you rely on was built by me, funded by my private consulting firm, and registered entirely under my limited liability company. I simply revoked your free licensing agreement. That is not corporate sabotage. That is basic contract law." Andre slammed his hand down on the table. "She is lying," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the web camera. "She is trying to distract you from the fact that she triggered a federal banking freeze. She is trying to destroy our father's legacy." I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile that made Mr. Sterling physically recoil. "I think we have spent enough time listening to fiction," I said. "It is time to discuss the actual financial reality of this business." I moved my mouse and clicked a button on my administrative dashboard. A notification chimed in the downtown conference room. 2 new participants had just entered the virtual meeting waiting room. I approved their entry immediately. The screen in the conference room split into 3 separate video feeds. On the left was my face. On the right were 2 impeccably dressed corporate attorneys sitting in a pristine law office in Buckhead. "Gentlemen," I said smoothly, "please allow me to introduce my lead corporate counsel. They are joining us this morning to oversee the legality of the vote my brother has just proposed." Pastor Williams leaned forward, his brow furrowed in deep concern. "Camille, what is the meaning of this?" "We are here to vote on an internal equity reallocation. We are trying to save the company from insolvency. You cannot save a company that has already been sold." "Pastor Williams," I replied gently. The absolute silence that fell over the boardroom was deafening. Even Andre stopped breathing. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open, his arrogant facade completely shattered by the sheer impossibility of my words. "Let us take a brief trip down memory lane," I said, keeping my tone conversational but deadly. 14 months ago, this firm faced a catastrophic cash flow crisis. Andre had been quietly siphoning millions of dollars from our operational reserves to fund an increasingly lavish lifestyle for his wife Bethany. He bought her imported luxury vehicles, funded a complete designer renovation of their current home, and paid off her exorbitant personal credit card debts using corporate accounts marked as business development. Andre lunged towards the laptop. "Shut your mouth, Camille," he screamed. "Turn her microphone off. Someone disconnect the call." Mr. Sterling stood up and slammed his hands on the table. "Sit down, Andre," he roared, his deep baritone voice shaking the glass walls of the room. "You will let her finish speaking." Andre froze. He looked at the circle of powerful men surrounding him. The blind loyalty they had always shown him was rapidly evaporating, replaced by the cold, hard suspicion of investors who realized they were being scammed. Andre slowly sank back into his chair, his chest heaving. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I said, nodding respectfully. As I was saying 14 months ago, the embezzlement caught up to him. We were 2 weeks away from defaulting on the mortgages for our 3 flagship boutique hotels in Midtown. To cover up his theft and avoid telling this board the truth, Andre took out a massive high-interest commercial bridge loan from a private equity lender. He leveraged the entire firm using our most valuable domestic properties as collateral. I watched the color completely drain from the faces of the board members. They had absolutely no idea. Andre had bypassed board approval to secure the loan, committing blatant corporate fraud to save his own skin. He promised the lender he would repay the bridge loan within 6 months, I continued. But he never did. He continued bleeding the company dry to keep his white wife dripping in diamonds. 8 months ago, the private equity lender initiated a quiet default protocol. They were preparing to seize our flagship properties and liquidate them. The family business was 48 hours away from total annihilation. My mother, Valerie, had been so obsessed with protecting Andre's image as the strong black male leader that she had completely ignored the gaping financial wounds he was inflicting on our father's legacy. But I could not let the legacy die, so I stepped in. I said, my voice dropping to a low, resonant pitch. I used the capital from my private consulting firm to create an anonymous proxy holding company. I approached the private equity lender, and I purchased the entirety of this firm's defaulted debt. The boardroom was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the emergency lighting. Andre looked like he was going to vomit. His hands were visibly shaking against the dark wood of the table. I pressed a button on my keyboard, sharing a digital document packet directly to the laptops of every board member in the room. The screens illuminated with certified legal filings, financial transfer receipts, and the original bridge loan contract. If you look at the documents I just provided, you will see the complete chain of custody I instructed. You will see that the anonymous holding company which purchased the debt is wholly owned by me. Pastor Williams picked up the printed packet Andre had handed out earlier and looked back at the screen, his hands trembling slightly. My brother called this emergency meeting to strip me of my 30% equity in the family trust, I said, allowing a trace of dark amusement to enter my voice. He wanted to dilute my shares to 0 to pay off the federal tax fines he incurred through his own wire fraud, but he fundamentally misunderstands the financial structure of the company he claims to run. I leaned forward toward my webcam, making sure my eyes locked directly with Andre's terrified gaze. I am not just a minority shareholder, Andre. I whispered the truth, slicing through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. I am the primary secured creditor of this entire enterprise. I own the debt. I hold the collateral. And because you have been in continuous default for over 8 months, I am officially invoking my legal right to call in the loan effective immediately. Andre let out a strangled, pathetic sound. It was the sound of a man watching his entire universe collapse into dust. You cannot do this, he gasped, tears welling in his eyes. You are destroying the family. You are destroying everything Dad built. Dad built a hospitality empire. I corrected him, my voice turning to ice. You turned it into a personal piggy bank for a woman who mocks our culture and treats our employees like servants. You destroyed this family, Andre. I am simply the one collecting the wreckage. I looked back at the stunned board members. Gentlemen, any vote you execute today regarding my equity is entirely void. Andre has no legal authority to restructure a company that is currently insolvent and completely beholden to its creditors. His title as Chief Executive Officer is now entirely powerless. The firm owes me $35 million payable immediately. Since the corporate accounts are frozen by the federal government, there is 0 liquid capital left. You have no way to satisfy the debt. I sat back in my chair, smoothing the lapel of my emerald blazer. My legal team will be arriving at the downtown headquarters in exactly 1 hour to begin the formal asset seizure process. I announced, my tone polite but absolute. I strongly suggest you advise my brother to start packing his personal belongings. This meeting is adjourned. I reached forward and severed the connection. The video feed went black, cutting off Andre's desperate sobbing and the chaotic shouting of the board members. I closed my laptop, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation. The invisible chains of family obligation that had bound me for 35 years were finally completely broken. I closed my laptop and let the silence of my penthouse wash over me for just a moment before standing up. The virtual board meeting was officially over, but the physical reality of the asset seizure was just beginning. I grabbed my leather handbag and headed down to the private garage where my driver was already waiting with the engine running. The morning traffic moving toward downtown Atlanta was heavy and slow, but I did not mind. I sat in the back of the luxury vehicle, watching the vibrant city wake up. Atlanta was a city built on the sweat and brilliance of Black entrepreneurs. My father had been one of them. He had started our hospitality firm with nothing but a small loan and an unrelenting work ethic. He had built an empire of boutique hotels that celebrated our culture and provided genuine luxury. He had intended for that legacy to generate generational wealth for our family. Instead, his own son had hollowed it out to finance a lifestyle of shallow greed and desperate social climbing. I was not driving downtown to destroy my father's legacy. I was driving downtown to surgically extract the tumor that was killing it. I arrived at our corporate headquarters on Peachtree Street 30 minutes before Andre was scheduled to arrive, because I was now legally recognized as the primary secured creditor of the insolvent enterprise. I had the absolute legal authority to enter the premises and secure my collateral. I walked through the revolving glass doors of the towering high-rise and headed straight for the executive elevators. The atmosphere on the executive floor was already crackling with an intense electric tension. My private legal team had arrived precisely on time. They were moving efficiently through the corridors, carrying heavy briefcases and stacks of court-authorized asset seizure documents. But they were not alone. Spread throughout the suite were federal auditors from the Criminal Investigation Division. They wore dark windbreakers and moved with a cold, methodical precision that sent a wave of absolute terror through the remaining office staff. The federal agents were already placing tamper evidence seals on the filing cabinets. They were cloning the hard drives of the executive desktop computers and boxing up boxes of physical financial records. The few administrative employees who had managed to come into the office, despite the software blackout, were standing in the hallways watching the federal raid in hushed, horrified whispers. They had spent years watching Andre strut around the office like an untouchable king. Now they were watching government agents systematically dismantle his throne. I walked past the whispering employees and gave them a polite, reassuring nod. I did not want them to panic about their own livelihoods. Their jobs were safe. It was only the executive suite that was about to be completely cleared out. I made my way to the main conference room located at the very center of the floor. It was a massive architectural statement piece, completely encased in floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass. It was designed so that the entire office could see the executives at work, projecting an image of transparency and power. Today, that glass box was going to serve as a public execution chamber for Andre's career. I walked through the heavy glass doors and moved directly to the head of the long mahogany table. I pulled out the massive, high-backed leather chair, the chief executive officer's chair, the chair my father had sat in for 20 years, the chair Andre had stolen and disgraced. I sat down, smoothing the lapel of my emerald green blazer. I placed my hands flat on the polished wood and looked out through the glass walls, watching the elevator banks at the far end of the hallway. I knew exactly what was happening down in the main lobby. Andre, Bethany, and my mother, Valerie, had undoubtedly arrived together. They were likely standing by the security desk, putting on a brave, desperate face. Andre would be trying to rally his fractured confidence. He had probably told Bethany and Valerie that the virtual board meeting was just a minor setback. He would have assured them that he still held the physical power of the office. He fully intended to march up to the executive floor, rally the remaining loyal employees, and have the lobby security team physically lock me out of the building. He still believed he could bluff his way out of a federal crime by yelling loudly enough and throwing his weight around. At exactly 8:00 the morning, the silver doors of the private executive elevator slid open. Andre stepped out first. His shoulders were pulled back, and his chin was thrust forward in a pathetic attempt to project absolute authority. Bethany stepped out right behind him. She was wearing a completely inappropriate pristine white designer dress, clutching a crocodile skin handbag that cost more than most of our employees made in a year. She was standing close to him, acting like the untouchable white corporate wife, ready to look down her nose at anyone who challenged her husband. Valerie followed them, her face a tight mask of manufactured dignity. They marched down the carpeted hallway, ready for battle, and then they stopped completely dead in their tracks. The arrogant bravado vanished from Andre's face in an instant, replaced by a look of profound, unadulterated shock. He had expected to find a dark, empty office. He had expected to walk in and establish his dominance over the remaining staff. Instead, he found his workplace crawling with federal agents in windbreakers, carrying boxes of his own fraudulent financial records. Bethany let out a sharp, audible gasp, raising a hand to her mouth. She stared at the federal auditors, her perfectly manicured facade cracking as the reality of the criminal investigation physically manifested right in front of her eyes. Valerie grabbed her chest, taking a stumbling step backward as she watched government officials placing evidence tape across the door of Andre's private office. But the worst shock was yet to come. Andre slowly turned his head, looking through the expansive glass walls of the main conference room, his eyes locked onto mine. I was sitting in his chair. I was leaning back, completely relaxed, flanked by my lead corporate attorneys. Standing just outside the glass doors was the building's head of security, a towering, broad-shouldered man named David, who was watching the scene with his arms crossed over his chest. The visual representation of my absolute victory was too much for Andre to process. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk tie. His face flushed a dark, dangerous red as sheer humiliation overrode whatever tiny shred of rational thought he had left. He realized that dozens of his own employees were watching him standing in the hallway, looking like a helpless, trespassing stranger in the very company he claimed to own. He stormed toward the conference room, ripping the heavy glass door open so violently it shuddered on its hinges. Bethany and Valerie hurried in right behind him, desperate to get out of the view of the whispering employees and the federal agents. "Get out of my chair!" Andre screamed, his voice echoing off the glass walls and spilling out into the hallway. "Get out of my building right now, Camille." I did not move a single muscle. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked up at him, maintaining a steady, unwavering gaze. "You do not have a building anymore, Andre," I replied, my voice cool and even. "And you certainly do not have a chair. You are a minority shareholder," he roared, slamming his fist down on the mahogany table. "I am the chief executive officer of this enterprise. I am the head of this family. You cannot just walk in here with your lawyers and stage a corporate coup. This is illegal. This is trespassing." He turned wildly toward the open door, looking at the head of security who was standing just outside the conference room. "David," Andre shouted, gesturing frantically toward me. "What are you doing, just standing there? I am the head of this company. I am giving you a direct order. Remove this woman from the premises immediately. Escort her out of the building and do whatever it takes to get her off my floor." David did not flinch. He did not step forward to grab my arm. He did not even look at Andre. The towering head of security slowly shifted his gaze, passing right over my screaming brother, and looked directly at me, waiting for my instruction. I held David's gaze and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. David finally turned to look at Andre, his expression completely blank. "I am sorry, sir," David said, his deep voice carrying easily through the open door. "But I do not take orders from you anymore. My team and I take our directives exclusively from the property ownership." Andre froze, his hands still raised in the air. He looked from David back to me, his mind desperately trying to process the security chief's words. Bethany clutched her expensive handbag to her chest, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Valerie let out a small, distressed whimper, finally realizing that the ground beneath their feet was entirely gone. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the polished table, intertwining my fingers. The trap had been set for months. They had walked right into it voluntarily, and now it was time to close the jaws. The silence inside that glass-walled conference room was so profound, it felt like a vacuum pressing against my ears. Andre stared at the towering head of security, his brain visibly misfiring as he tried to process words that simply did not fit into his arrogant reality. "Property ownership," Andre stammered, his voice stripped of all its former booming authority. "What are you talking about, David? We lease this entire floor. The building is owned by Vanguard Holdings. You work for the management company. You do not work for her." I did not smile. I did not gloat. I reached to my right and picked up the thick, black leather binder sitting on the table next to my lead attorney. I placed my hand flat on top of the heavy cover and pushed. The binder slid smoothly across the polished mahogany surface, coming to a stop exactly 2 inches from Andre's trembling hands. "You cannot evict the landlord, Andre," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, resonant pitch that commanded every ounce of oxygen in the room. He looked down at the binder as if it were a live, explosive device. His hands shook uncontrollably as he reached out and flipped open the heavy leather cover. Bethany leaned in close beside him, her eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text printed on the first page. Valerie moved behind them, her breath hitching in her throat as she tried to comprehend the devastating documentation laid out before them. 6 months ago, I continued maintaining absolute steady eye contact with my brother. The anonymous private equity firm known as Vanguard Holdings purchased this entire high-rise building. If you had actually read any of the standard acquisition notices sent to your desk, you would have seen the corporate restructuring details. But you do not read the paperwork, do you, Andre? You just sign whatever is put in front of you so you can get back to your long lunches and your golf games. He flipped to the second page, his eyes scanning the certified state seals and the notarized signatures. Vanguard Holdings is a proxy acquisition firm, I stated, clearly, ensuring my voice carried to my mother and sister-in-law. It is entirely funded, owned, and operated by my private consulting limited liability company, which means, Andre, that for the last 6 months, every single time you paid rent for this lavish corporate headquarters, you were paying it directly into my personal bank accounts. Bethany let out a choked, horrified gasp. She looked at me, her pristine white designer dress suddenly looking entirely out of place in a room where she held absolutely zero power. You own the building, she whispered, the reality finally piercing through her manufactured upper-class facade. I own the building, Bethany, I confirmed softly. But the real issue is not who owns the building. The real issue is who has stopped paying for it. I gestured toward the third tab in the binder. Andre flipped the page, and I watched the last remaining drops of blood drain from his face. 4 months ago, I explained, adopting the clinical detached tone of a seasoned real estate investor. You quietly stopped paying the commercial rent for this executive floor. You needed massive amounts of liquid capital to cover up your extensive corporate embezzlement. You needed to hide the fact that you were taking out unauthorized bridge loans. You needed cash to pay the deposits on Bethy's new mansion in Alpharetta and her imported luxury vehicles. So, you defaulted on the lease, hoping you could steal enough money from the Dubai merger to pay the back rent before the management company issued a lockout notice. Andre could not speak. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer mathematical perfection of his own destruction. As your landlord, I issued 3 separate formal notices of default over the past 90 days. I continued, pointing to the copies of the certified letters in the binder. Because you are the chief executive officer, those notices went directly to you. You hid them. You hid them from the board of directors. You hid them from Calvin, the chief financial officer. You shoved them in a drawer and prayed for a miracle. But miracles do not save men who steal from their own family. My mother, Valerie, pushed past Bethany and grabbed the edge of the table. Camille, she pleaded, her voice trembling with absolute terror. Camille, please, you cannot do this. You are talking about throwing our historic business out onto the street. This firm is your father's legacy. We have hundreds of employees in this building. The employees are perfectly safe, Mother, I replied, my tone completely unyielding. I have already drafted new independent employment contracts for the administrative and operational staff. They will be transitioned over to my private firm with full benefits and a 20% salary increase. I am not evicting the workers. I am only evicting the parasites. I nodded to my lead attorney, who reached into his briefcase and pulled out 3 stark white envelopes. He slid them across the table, one for Andre, one for Bethany, who was technically listed as a highly paid corporate consultant, despite never doing a single day of actual work, and one for Valerie, who sat on the executive advisory board. Under Georgia commercial real estate law, I stated, reading the room its final rights, a landlord has the absolute authority to immediately terminate a lease and reclaim the property following a sustained 90-day default. This action is vastly accelerated when the tenant is currently the subject of an active federal criminal investigation for wire fraud and embezzlement. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs. Those are your formal, legally binding eviction notices, I announced. The federal auditors currently swarming this floor are here to seize the business assets and secure evidence of your financial crimes, but I am here to reclaim my physical space. You have exactly 1 hour to pack whatever personal items the federal agents allow you to take. After that, security will escort you out of the lobby, and you will never step foot on my property ever again. Andre stared at the white envelope bearing his name. The sophisticated, powerful executive he had pretended to be his entire life was completely gone. He was nothing but a hollow shell of a man, entirely exposed and entirely ruined. He looked up at me, and for the very first time in 35 years, I did not see arrogance in his eyes. I saw absolute visceral fear. "You set me up," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You knew I was drowning in the bridge loans, and you just sat back and watched me sink. You planned this whole thing. I did not force you to steal from the corporate accounts, Andre," I replied calmly. "I did not force you to buy luxury cars with company money. I did not force you to cancel my corporate card and leave me stranded in the Middle East. You dug this grave with your own 2 hands. I just bought the cemetery." The heavy silence that followed was broken by the sound of federal agents moving down the hallway outside. We could hear the sharp, ripping sound of evidence tape being applied to the doors of the surrounding executive suite. The reality of their situation was closing in from every possible angle. There was no money left. There was no company left. There was no building left. I watched my family standing frozen in the middle of the glass conference room. They had built their entire world on the assumption that I would always be there to quietly fix their mistakes. They had assumed my silence was a sign of weakness. They had mistaken my loyalty for submission. Now they were standing in the dead center of an empire I had secretly purchased right out from under them, with absolutely nowhere to run. The heavy glass doors of the conference room offered absolutely no protection from the devastating reality crashing down around them. Andre held the stark white eviction envelope as if the paper itself were burning his skin. The polished, sophisticated facade he had spent his entire adult life cultivating was gone, entirely stripped away to reveal the terrified, inadequate little boy hiding underneath. But it was Bethany who broke first. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the perfect wealthy country club marriage completely disintegrate in real time. Bethany stared at the federal agents moving methodically through the hallway outside. She watched a stern-looking woman in a dark windbreaker place a red evidence seal over the door of the main accounting office. The pristine white designer dress Bethany had chosen specifically to intimidate my staff suddenly looked like a surrender flag. Her eyes darted frantically from the federal auditors back to the thick black binder sitting on the mahogany table. I could practically see the mathematical equations firing in her head. She was finally connecting the dots. The frozen bank accounts at the charity gala last night, the canceled corporate credit cards, the unpaid rent for this towering high-rise. She realized with sudden violent clarity that the multi-million-dollar Alpharetta mansion they were supposed to close on today was completely gone. The imported luxury vehicles were gone. Her entire social standing among the Atlanta elite was entirely obliterated. And far worse, she realized she was going down with the ship. Bethany spun around and shoved Andre hard in the chest. Her perfectly manicured hands slammed against his expensive silk tie. "What did you do?" she screamed, her voice shrill and piercing, shattering the quiet tension of the executive floor. "What did you do to the money, Andre?" Andre stumbled backward, his hands raised defensively. "Bethany, keep your voice down," he hissed, glancing, terrified at the federal agents lingering just outside the glass. "We can handle this quietly. Do not make a scene. Do not make a scene," she shrieked, taking another aggressive step toward him. "The federal government is currently boxing up our financial records. My credit cards were declined in front of the entire Heritage Excellence Board last night. You told me the business was thriving. You told me the Dubai merger was going to double our net worth." She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, but kept her furious gaze locked on her husband. "You said she was just a glorified assistant." Bethany screamed, the ugly truth of their private conversations finally spilling out into the open. "You told me she just fetched coffee and ran spreadsheets. You told me the money was ours. You swore to me that you were the one bringing in all the capital." I remained perfectly still, watching her racist, elitist illusions shatter against the brick wall of my actual brilliance. She had spent 5 years treating me with thinly veiled contempt, making passive-aggressive comments about my hair, my clothes, and my quiet demeanor at family dinners. She had genuinely believed that her proximity to the male head of the family made her superior to the black woman who was actually funding her entire existence. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my steepled fingers. "Actually, Bethany," I said, my voice slicing through her hysterical shouting, "I think you should be much less concerned about your social status and much more concerned about your upcoming federal indictment." Bethany froze. She whipped her head around to look at me, her eyes wide with sudden terror. "What are you talking about?" she breathed. "I do not work here. I do not have anything to do with this company. I smiled, a slow, calculated smile that made the remaining color completely drain from her face. That is not what the official tax documents say, Bethany, I replied smoothly. According to the fraudulent corporate tax returns Andre filed over the last 3 years, you are listed as a highly compensated senior executive consultant. He funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into your personal accounts under the guise of consulting fees to avoid taxation. You signed those documents. Your name is on the asset declarations for the luxury vehicles bought with embezzled company funds. She looked as though the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath her. I did not know anything about that, she stammered, taking a frantic step away from Andre as if his physical proximity might infect her. He handled all the finances. I just signed where he told me to sign. I did not know the money was stolen. The Internal Revenue Service does not care about your marital ignorance, Bethany, I stated coldly. They only care about your signature on the dotted line. You gladly spent the stolen money. You are an active participant in federal wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. I suggest you stop screaming at your husband and start looking for a very aggressive criminal defense attorney. Bethany let out a choked, hysterical sob. She looked at the federal agent standing outside the glass walls. The white privilege she had weaponized her entire life was absolutely useless in a room full of federal auditors examining a paper trail of irrefutable corporate fraud. She turned back to Andre, her face contorted with pure hatred. I want a divorce. She spat the words flying out of her mouth like venom. I am leaving you. I am turning over every single financial document I have to the authorities, and I am telling them everything you did. Do not you ever speak to me again. She turned on her heel and practically ran toward the conference room door, desperately trying to distance herself from the wreckage. My mother, Valerie, watched her golden daughter-in-law flee the room in absolute horror. The grand, powerful family dynasty she had sacrificed me to build was violently imploding right in front of her eyes. Her golden boy was a confirmed criminal. The white wife she had always bragged about to her country club friends was turning state's evidence to save her own skin. The historic black enterprise my father had bled for was entirely bankrupt and facing federal liquidation. Valerie slowly turned her head and looked at me. She stepped around the heavy mahogany table. Her hands were shaking violently. The proud, rigid posture of the Atlanta matriarch was completely gone. She looked old, fragile, and entirely broken. She looked at the 2 elite corporate attorneys sitting beside me. She looked at the towering head of security waiting for my command. She finally realized what I had known for years. I was the true heir to my father's brilliance, and she had thrown me away. She walked up to the edge of the desk, right in front of my chair. Tears were streaming down her perfectly contoured cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She reached out with trembling hands, as if she wanted to touch my arm, but she stopped just short, afraid of my reaction. Camille, she whispered, her voice cracking with a desperate, agonizing sorrow. Camille, my beautiful daughter, please. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I sat completely still and let her beg. Please, she sobbed, clasping her hands together in front of her chest. Look at what is happening to us. This is your family. This is your blood. You are so smart, Camille. You are so brilliant. You know how to fix this. We can fix this together. I will make Andre step down. I will give you the title of Chief Executive Officer. I will give you whatever you want. Just please do not let them put your brother in prison. Do not let them take everything your father built. I am begging you as your mother. Save us. She was playing her final card. She was trying to weaponize the deep primal desire every daughter has for her mother's love and approval. She was offering me the crown she had stolen from me, offering me the validation I had spent my entire life working for. She thought she could finally acknowledge my brilliance, and I would immediately fold, offering up my wealth and my power to rescue her precious son from his own catastrophic choices. I looked at the tears streaming down her face. I looked at Andre, who was slumped against the far wall of the conference room, weeping silently into his hands, a thoroughly defeated man. I felt absolutely nothing. The well of my empathy had run completely dry. You do not want a daughter, I said, my voice perfectly steady, echoing clearly in the quiet room. You just want a human shield for your son. You chose to nurture his arrogance while you tried to suffocate my potential because you were a slave to outdated patriarchal traditions. You demanded that I diminish myself so he could feel tall. You allowed him to cancel my corporate card and leave me stranded in the Middle East. You watched him publicly drag my name through the mud on social media yesterday, and you applauded him for it. Valerie let out a quiet, wounded whimper, shaking her head side to side in denial. You only see my value now because your golden boy has completely bankrupted your life. I continued, leaning forward in my chair. You do not get to cash out on my brilliance after you spent 35 years trying to bury it. I looked at her with absolute ice-cold clarity. I did not raise my voice. I delivered the words with the lethal precision of a final verdict. You backed the wrong horse, Mother. Valerie gasped, as if the words had physically struck her in the chest. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth, staring at me as if she were looking at a complete stranger. I turned my attention to the head of security who was standing at attention just outside the open glass doors. I gave him a single sharp nod. David stepped fully into the conference room. 2 federal agents moved in right behind him, their faces completely devoid of sympathy. The 60-minute countdown I established earlier is officially active. I announced, addressing my mother and brother for the very last time. You have exactly 1 hour to clear your personal belongings from my property. You will pack under the direct supervision of these federal agents to ensure no corporate evidence is removed from the premises. When the hour is up, David will personally escort you out through the main lobby. I stood up from the chief executive officer's chair, smoothing the front of my blazer. I picked up my leather handbag and looked at the 2 people who had tried to destroy me. Do not ask me for another favor, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute finality. Do not call my phone. Do not attempt to leverage our bloodline. This family business is officially closed. I turned on my heel and walked out of the glass conference room. I did not look back. I strode down the carpeted hallway of my own building, the federal agents stepping respectfully out of my way as I passed. The sound of my mother's weeping faded behind me, replaced by the steady, triumphant rhythm of my own footsteps, walking toward a future that belonged entirely to me. 3 months passed in a blur of swift, uncompromising justice. The federal raid on our corporate headquarters was only the opening sequence of a total systematic dismantling of the toxic empire my mother and brother had built. Once the Criminal Investigation Division secured the financial records, the entire house of cards collapsed with breathtaking speed. I watched from the comfortable distance of my penthouse as the life they had known was completely eradicated. The family hospitality firm was officially placed into federal receivership. Because I was legally recognized as the primary secured creditor, I had the absolute right to execute a hostile takeover of the remaining viable assets. During the corporate liquidation process, I purchased the flagship boutique hotels and the prime real estate holdings for a fraction of their original market value. I absorbed the healthy properties directly into my private limited liability company, effectively transferring the wealth my father built out of their greedy hands and safely into my own. Andre did not walk away with a single cent. He was formally indicted by a federal grand jury on multiple felony counts, including wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion. Because all of his financial accounts remained frozen by the government, he could not afford the elite team of criminal defense attorneys he desperately needed. The arrogant chief executive officer, who used to wear bespoke suits and drink expensive scotch, was reduced to sitting in a bleak courtroom, relying on an overworked court-appointed lawyer to negotiate his plea deal. He was currently awaiting sentencing, restricted to house arrest, with an ankle monitor completely stripped of his freedom and his dignity. Bethany wasted absolutely no time attempting to save herself. The very same week, the federal agents raided the office she filed for a highly publicized, messy divorce. She scrambled to control the narrative, granting tearful interviews to local Atlanta gossip blogs, claiming she was a naive victim who had been financially abused and manipulated by her husband. She thought her tears and her white privilege would shield her from the consequences. She was entirely wrong. The federal investigators did not care about her manufactured tears. They cared about the paper trail. They traced the embezzled corporate funds directly to her personal bank accounts. They seized her imported luxury vehicles. They confiscated her massive collection of designer handbags and jewelry, identifying them as assets purchased with stolen money. She demanded exorbitant alimony in the divorce proceedings, completely ignoring the fact that Andre had absolutely zero liquid capital to give her. The pristine, affluent socialite was forced to move into a cheap, cramped rental property, completely shunned by the wealthy country club circles she had sacrificed her soul to join. But the most profound and devastating fall from grace belonged to my mother, Valerie. For decades, Valerie had defined herself by her proximity to power. She had built her entire identity around being the untouchable matriarch of a prominent African-American business dynasty. She had hosted lavish charity galas, rubbed elbows with Atlanta politicians, and judged anyone who did not meet her exacting superficial standards. She had enabled my brother's destructive behavior and actively suffocated my potential, all to protect the illusion of her perfect family. When the company went bankrupt, the banks immediately foreclosed on her sprawling, heavily mortgaged suburban estate. The property had been leveraged against the business to hide Andre's initial cash flow problems. Valerie lost the house, the luxury cars, and the massive operating budget that had funded her social dominance. She was forced to downsize to a tiny, outdated apartment complex well outside the perimeter of the city. The wealthy friends who used to attend her lavish dinner parties completely abandoned her. The prominent pastors and business leaders who had always kissed her hand simply stopped returning her calls. The elite Black society of Atlanta is incredibly protective of its history and its integrity. When the news broke that Valerie had actively enabled her son to embezzle millions of dollars and destroy a historic minority-owned enterprise, she was permanently blacklisted. Her social standing was irreversibly erased, leaving her alone with nothing but the crushing weight of her own catastrophic choices. While their world burned to ash, I was busy building something magnificent from the embers. I completely rebranded the enterprise. It was no longer the dysfunctional toxic family business that relied on nepotism and gender bias. It was now a modern, streamlined, global acquisitions firm operating entirely under my own name. I did exactly what I promised I would do for the hard-working people who had been caught in the crossfire. I retained all the loyal administrative and operational staff who had suffered under Andre's incompetent leadership. I transitioned their contracts over to my new firm, upgrading their healthcare benefits and giving them an immediate 20% salary increase. I promoted Calvin, the former chief financial officer, to a senior advisory role. I elevated David, the towering head of security, to the director of corporate safety for all our domestic properties. I cultivated a workplace culture built on absolute meritocracy, mutual respect, and quiet excellence. The employees who had spent years walking on eggshells around my brother now walked through the office with their heads held high, knowing their brilliance would actually be rewarded instead of stolen. The physical transformation of the corporate headquarters was my favorite victory. I stripped the executive floor of its heavy, outdated mahogany furniture and the massive imposing oil paintings of my brother that used to dominate the lobby. I replaced them with sleek modern art created by local Black artists, floor-to-ceiling glass partitions, and an open collaborative workspace. I reclaimed the space, making it a reflection of the future, rather than a monument to the past. Tonight, I was celebrating that future. I stood on the expansive penthouse balcony of my new corporate headquarters, the very same towering high-rise I had legally evicted my family from just 90 days ago. The warm evening breeze of the Georgia autumn swept across the balcony, carrying the faint, distant sounds of the bustling city below. Behind me, the newly renovated executive suite was glowing with warm amber light and the sounds of genuine celebration. The executives from the massive Dubai hotel group had flown in earlier that afternoon, alongside their new investment partners from Geneva. We had just finalized a secondary acquisition deal that would expand my firm's portfolio across the European market. Waiters in crisp black uniforms circulated through the room carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The atmosphere was triumphant, buzzing with the energy of visionary people doing exceptional work. I stepped away from the crowd, leaning my hands against the cool metal railing of the balcony. I looked out over the glittering Atlanta skyline, a sprawling sea of illuminated skyscrapers and endless possibilities. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my vintage champagne, letting the crisp, bright taste settle on my tongue. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my personal cell phone. The screen illuminating my face in the dim evening light. There was a new unread text message waiting on the screen. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. It was the first time she had attempted to contact me since the day my security team escorted her out of the building. I stared at the notification, feeling a profound, absolute stillness in my chest. I unlocked the screen and opened the message. "Camille, please." The text read, "I have nothing left. I am so alone. I know we made mistakes, but I am your mother. Please help me." I read the words twice, absorbing the sheer pathetic desperation dripping from every syllable. She was not apologizing for the decades of emotional manipulation. She was not apologizing for demanding I shrink myself so her son could shine. She was not apologizing for leaving me stranded in a foreign country. She was only reaching out because she had finally run out of money and she needed a new host to attach herself to. She thought the biological fact of her motherhood would be enough to crack my armor. She was wrong. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I did not feel a sudden urge to rescue her. The invisible emotional strings she used to pull to control my behavior had been completely severed. I tapped the screen, navigating to her contact profile. I pressed the delete button, wiping the message from my inbox forever. Then I pressed the block button, ensuring she would never be able to reach my phone again. I did the exact same thing for Andre's number and Bethy's number, closing the door on their toxicity with absolute finality. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned my attention back to the beautiful, glowing city skyline. For 35 years, I had been told that my worth was defined by my willingness to sacrifice myself for my family. I had been told that my brilliance was a threat and my independence was a betrayal. I had allowed them to convince me that security was something you inherited through bloodlines and blind loyalty. They had taken everything from me and demanded I be grateful for the scraps. But as I stood on the balcony of my own building, listening to the sounds of my own thriving company, I knew the absolute truth. True security is not inherited. It is not handed down through titles or expected through family obligations. True security is built. It is forged in the dark through relentless hard work, quiet strategy, and the unwavering belief in your own intrinsic value. It is holding your ground when the people who are supposed to love you try to tear you down. I took one final sip of my champagne, breathing in the sweet, victorious air of the city. I had survived their betrayal. I had orchestrated my own justice. And out of the ashes of their greed, I had built an empire they could never touch. "We are cutting you loose," my brother texted while I was standing in a hotel lobby halfway across the world. "Your company card is canceled. Figure out how to get home yourself, loser." He thought he was leaving me stranded and penniless so he could steal my $100 million deal. He had no idea that I was about to smile, pull out my own black card, and initiate a financial blackout that would cost him his entire empire. What happened when he walked into the office the next morning changed our family forever. I am Camille and I am 35 years old. Until that exact moment, I was the senior director of acquisitions for my family's Atlanta-based luxury hospitality firm. For the past 72 hours, I had not slept a single wink. I had been sitting in high-stakes boardrooms, drinking endless cups of black coffee, negotiating the most lucrative international hotel merger our company had ever seen. I had done the financial modeling, the risk assessments, and the grueling face-to-face negotiations with the executives in Dubai. Andre, my older brother, had contributed absolutely nothing, but he carried the title of Chief Executive Officer because our mother, Valerie, believed the family business needed a male figurehead. I stood at the polished marble front desk of the Burj Al Arab, my luggage resting beside me. The concierge, a polite man in a tailored suit, swiped my corporate card through the machine. He frowned and tried it again. "I am so sorry, madame," he said, lowering his voice out of professional discretion. "The card has been declined." My phone vibrated in my hand. I looked down and read Andre's text. He had waited until the exact moment the ink was dry on the preliminary merger documents to cut off my financial lifeline. He knew my hotel bill was hovering around $8,000. He knew a last-minute international flight back to Georgia would cost thousands more. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to call him crying and begging for a flight home so he could force me to hand over the final proprietary valuation files in exchange for a coach ticket. He planned to step up to the podium at the Atlanta press conference the following morning and take full credit for my brilliance. Instead of crying or causing a scene, I simply smiled at the concierge. "My apologies," I said smoothly. "Corporate accounting must be migrating our accounts this morning. Let me use another card." I reached into my designer handbag and bypassed the wallet holding my useless company identification. From a hidden zippered pocket, I pulled out a solid metal matte black American Express Centurion card. It was a card my family had absolutely no idea existed. It was not linked to our hospitality firm in any way. It was funded entirely by my own private, highly lucrative consulting firm, an LLC. I had quietly built over the last 5 years while Andre spent his days playing golf at exclusive country clubs in Buckhead. The concierge swiped the heavy black card. It went through instantly. I signed the $8,000 receipt without blinking and handed it back to him. Then I unlocked my phone and replied to my brother's cruel text with a single sentence. "Thank you for letting me know." I did not wait for his reply. I tipped the bellhop generously and had my bags loaded into a waiting private car. As the luxury sedan glided through the sunlit streets of Dubai heading toward the international airport, I pulled out my laptop and opened it on my knees. If Andre wanted to cut me loose, he was about to learn what happened when the anchor holding his entire career together suddenly detached. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, I had learned early on that love and respect in our household were distributed based on gender rather than merit. My mother, Valerie, was a formidable woman in the local black business community, but she harbored deeply traditional toxic views about succession. When our father passed away 5 years ago, leaving behind a thriving hospitality empire, she immediately placed Andre in the executive chair. Andre was charismatic and handsome, but he was financially illiterate. I was the one with the advanced degree in economics. I was the one who spotted market trends and salvaged failing properties. Yet, my mother constantly reminded me of my place. "You have to support your brother Camille," she would say whenever I pointed out his reckless spending or his failure to read contract details. "A strong black family needs a strong black man leading it. It is your duty as his sister to make sure he succeeds. Do not let your pride ruin your father's legacy." For years, I swallowed my pride and did exactly that. I covered up his administrative errors. I stayed up late fixing his disastrous budget projections before board meetings. I did the grueling analytical work while he posed for magazine covers and accepted awards for business strategies I had written. I allowed my own mother to diminish my brilliance to accommodate her son's fragile ego. But sitting in the back of that car, looking out at the desert skyline, I realized my duty to them was officially over. I logged into the company's secure administrative server. As the senior director of acquisitions, I had designed the entire digital infrastructure for our international clients. Andre barely knew how to open a spreadsheet, let alone navigate an encrypted cloud drive. With a few rapid keystrokes, I located his administrative profile. I revoked his access to the master negotiation files for the Dubai merger. I changed the security protocols, locking him out of the client communication portal entirely. I scrubbed his permissions from the financial projections I had built from scratch. It was a mechanical, silent action, but it felt more satisfying than any screaming match ever could. I was not stealing company property. I was simply securing my own intellectual labor and executing my right to data privacy upon termination. If he wanted to take credit for the deal at a press conference the next morning, he was going to have to do it without any of the actual data. He was going to have to stand in front of a room full of investors and reporters and explain a $100 million merger he fundamentally did not understand. I arrived at the airport and bypassed the main terminal entirely. Using my black card, I booked a first-class suite on the next Emirates flight to Atlanta. The sheer luxury of the private airport lounge stood in stark contrast to the betrayal I was processing. I took a hot shower in the lounge suite, changed into comfortable cashmere travel clothes, and boarded the massive aircraft. As I settled into my spacious private cabin, the flight attendant offered me a warm towel and asked what I would like to drink before takeoff. "Champagne, please," I requested, sinking back into the plush leather seat. Just as I took my first sip, my phone illuminated with a barrage of incoming messages. Andre had finally tried to log into the system to download the files for his morning presentation. The texts came through in rapid, frantic succession. "Camille, what is going on with the server? Why is my password bouncing back? Unlock the Dubai portal right now. I am not playing with you, Camille. Send me the master files immediately." He was panicking. The golden child, who had never faced a single consequence in his entire life, was suddenly staring down the barrel of a highly publicized press conference with absolutely nothing to show for it. He could not answer a single technical question about the merger without my spreadsheets guiding him. My phone rang loudly, shattering the quiet elegance of the first-class cabin. It was Andre calling. I watched his name flash on the screen, feeling a profound sense of detachment. The little girl who used to crave her family validation was gone. The exhausted executive who had broken her back to build their wealth was gone. In her place was a woman who finally recognized her own terrifying power. "Ma'am," the flight attendant murmured, leaning in politely. "We are preparing for takeoff. We ask that all passengers switch their devices to airplane mode." "Of course," I smiled at her. I looked down at my ringing phone. I did not decline the call. I simply swiped down, opening my settings, and tapped the airplane icon. The call abruptly cut off, severing my connection to the ground, to Dubai, and to the brother who had just tried to discard me. I placed the phone face down on the polished wood console next to my champagne. I had 14 hours of uninterrupted flight time ahead of me. 14 hours to rest and prepare for the war that was waiting for me in Atlanta. I closed my eyes and let the steady hum of the engines carry me toward the sky, fully aware that as soon as the plane leveled out and the in-flight wireless internet activated, I was going to finish tearing his kingdom down. The greatest lesson I learned from my family betrayal is that true